Hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 2 of Bitz and Chitz, a brazen broadcast special where today we have Bitz with Chitz. He's going to be going over a pile of fun items that he's been avidly collecting and musing over for quite a long time and is looking forward to sharing with you all. I'll let him run down the rest of what's going to be talked about, but here we have it.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about mounts. And I say that neutrally because Wolf Boys are a really important unit, right? In the old world, they're in rare. In Warhammer armies, they're also in rare. Light cavalry is incredibly powerful battlefield tool that you are going to want to use against a wide range of opponents. Um, and at the same time, modeling hobgoblins is always a challenge, right? Always a challenge. And so, what we're going to talk about today is going to be wolves and substitutes for wolves, and my recommendations for how easy to kitbash some of these things are. We're going to start with a lot of GW products, and then we're going to move out to look at the kind of the wider market. I'm going to play it safe with some, and I'm going to give you kind of a view of how daring some of the other things you could potentially do as a conversion project are. But along the way, I'm going to be dismissing quite a lot of our candidates because they might look nice or you might be tempted. But actually, I'm going to explain to you why some of these are really bad kits or really bad choices. So hopefully that'll be helpful. But in the meantime, along the way, I'm sure Reaver's going to weigh in with personal taste because I do think that's a really important thing when it comes to getting your hobgoblins mounted up and operational.
Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to it. I have not assembled any Wolf Riders yet, so this will be on the fly, and we'll definitely take some inspiration from this going forward. So have at it. Let's go for number 1.
So number one has to be because they made them and they look good. It has to be the Snarlfangs, and the Snarlfangs are the modern incarnation of Goblin Wolf Riders, right? And if you want, you can just buy these straight out of the box, and absolutely no issue whatsoever. You can just use them with weapon options that make sense for you. They've got a command section in there. They are wolf riders. Your opponent will know what they are looking at. The only caveats I would give you with these: number one, the riders are common goblins. They are small. If your hobgoblins have a particular aesthetic, they will look like they are inferior to those hobgoblins. They are smaller. They're smaller than hobgots, and that carries a drawback. And tied to that, if you don't happen to like the way the riders look, you are fucked. Because this is a modern Age of Sigmar kit. And I will spare you detailed look at the sprue, but suffice to say, this is not a kit with 5 wolves and then you pop 5 riders on top of it. This is one of those Zangor style kits where it's like, oh, here's the front left leg and it's attached to the rider's front left leg and it's got, you know, a seam that goes under the bottom in a diagonal effect. So, like, unless you built them and then painstakingly trimmed away the riders, this is not a utility kit. Like a lot of AOS kits, if you don't like the way they look on the box, I don't recommend that you buy these because it's a hell of a lot of work and quite tedious in some cases to try and divorce the goblins from the wolves.
I think we've heard the infamy of this kit a few times on the Discord. So without experience, I would
I'm
definitely
sure
lean on
definitely.
the wealth of people who've made the same comment as you. But there's certainly stuff to like in this kit. I like the banner. Always nice to have integral command options, I would say. But yeah, it's a good aesthetic. There's not really a whole lot to complain about unless, like you said, there's a need to have a specific look of Hobgoblin.
I agree. I like mine, and I'm happy with them and the way they look on the box. I like the Mongolian aesthetic. I like the fact that they've kept a lot of things. I like the fact that this is, by Age of Sigmar standards, this is a hit, right? This is a low key thing. The Rippers Snarlfangs that were an Undercry warband that came before, sorry, an Underworld's warband. Undercry doesn't exist. Um, they were good too, but there are only 3 of them and they're not on sale anymore. I don't think they're worth the investment. I think these guys are absolutely fine. Just buy two boxes and then put them on, square 25s, and you'll be absolutely laughing. All right, so that's option one. Option two is a bit of a left field option, but you'll see that a lot of this comes from what happens when you type in the word wolf to Warhammer.com. And one of the first things you get if you do that is Radukar the Wolf. Now, Radukar the Wolf is not a mount. However, he is a giant vampire villain who is wearing two massive wolf pelts, um, one of which has a leg sticking out of it. Now, all I'm just going to say very quickly is if you're making a foot Khan, you could do worse than pick up a cheap Radukar the Wolf from somebody who stopped playing Cursed City, just snip his head off and replace it with a green skin head, and then paint him up. You could even make your Black Orc war boss on foot out of Radukar the Wolf, providing you're willing to do the head swap, because it kind of plays into that whole hobgoblin aesthetic of being, out on the steppes and surrounded by wolves, wolves being the focal point of your whole culture. Haven't done it yet. I will do it. Obviously, he's tall and burly for a green skin, but I think with a good paint job, I actually personally think that would make quite a fun Khan on foot. But maybe we'll have to wait and see until I finish that project before we can judge it for sure.
Yeah, that's a fun idea. I hadn't expected what you were going to do with this image, seeing the slate of things we're looking at today, but that's a fun option. And even though, Curse City infamously flopped a bit, there's some good models in there. I have the dwarf hero from that. You will have to contend with the push fit nature, but in this case, where you'd probably just be doing a head swap, all you'd have to do is like touch up some fur, to fix in the end, which would be, I think that'd be pretty straightforward. That'd be fun.
Right, minimal, very doable, I think. All right. Well, look, let's get into the meat of it, and this here is wargs. Okay, we're going to talk about wargs for the next four entries, maybe five, because wargs are a very useful set of mount-only miniatures that you can buy from GW for relatively affordable prices. So specifically, if you go to Warhammer.com and type in the word wargs, you don't get the wargs until the sixth entry because you have to scroll through the Armiger Wargraves. However, if you search for wargs PM, you get all the wargs because of the way that the trademarks work. And so I have reviewed all of them, and this is what I have reached the conclusion. The best wargs are called fell wargs. There are two different types, and the fell wargs look a lot more like wolves. I think they look a bit better than the wolves that shipped with the snarlfangs. They also are useful because they have much broader shoulders, and then they have a narrow back. If you've ever done conversion work with rider miniatures, you'll know that you have to try and marry the kind of width of their leg with a good contact point on the mount. And the fell wargs both have good wolfy faces, good pelt, with fur detail that you can pick out. But then they also have good places to sit just behind that main pelt. And the reason for that is because you can actually get them with riders pre-supplied. Now that kit is called Hunter Orcs on Fell Wargs. Look, it's not perfect for many reasons. Reason number one is that those are Lord of the Rings orcs and they are not built like hobgoblins. They're not far off. I think they would need head swap work. Other people would disagree. If you run them plain, I think you'd be fine. Personally, I don't like the arms. I think they're too spindly because it's Lord of the Rings. And then also they've got several of them have got just like visible six packs because there's a torso sculpt that's just an orc with his six pack out and it's rippling with muscles and it's really weird. Because like you'll see when you see the picture, the armor has had this cut out on purpose, as if he's heading to GAY for a Saturday night. But on the whole, if you're looking for an easy, low impact job, you could do worse than buying Hunter Orcs on Felwargs. Because what you would be doing is buying a mount and rider that are pre married from the waist up. You could even do a torso swap on these, right? You could keep the legs as hobgoblin looking legs, and then you could trim someone else and stick them on top of those legs, no issue. I would extend that to a kit called Narzug and Thimble, both trademarked, Hunter Orc Captains. This contains a pretty cool sculpt I don't know which one is Narzug and which one is Thimble, so I'm going to decide that Narzug is the one that's on a wolf. He's got his own Felwarg. He's got a cool dynamic pose. He's got a jaggedy weapon. And he's actually got a pretty good face to be a hobgoblin, to be honest, without you even needing to do a conversion. I would do a head swap myself, but then I love my head swaps. The issue is that that kit is Forge World, and it's £37.50 for 3 miniatures. I can't recommend it at that price, but if you can find it cheaper, then you could have a lot of fun with that. He would make a pretty cool card. Now, here is where I'm going to say something controversial about wargs, because you might remember the wargs from the original Lord of the Rings films were really ugly, and they looked quite strange. And those wargs are still on sale, and they're called wild wargs. And the good thing about the wild wargs compared to the fell wargs is that they're extremely cheap. However, they're extremely cheap because it's two sculpts, 3 times. So you're buying 6 wargs for £12.50, but you're not. You're buying 2 wargs twice. And from that perspective, given that they're quasi dynamically posed, your riders would look very samey. I also don't like the eyes on the wild wargs, and I don't think it's worth doing surgery to trim them back or replace the head or any of that kind of stuff. So I don't recommend the wild wargs personally, but they are affordable and distinctive, and they've got space for a rider to sit on the back. So realistically, you could do a lot worse. That about wraps it up for wargs. Now that you've had a look at their faces, Jared, where are you on the great warg debate of 2024?
Yeah, so I do have a singular, what now is called a wild warg. Uh, it's fine. It's just an old sculpt. Like you said, the repeats would kind of kill it ranked up. But that said, the other version, the fell wargs, I like that they're not all at a dead out run like we see with most kits of Games Workshop these days. There's a couple more like stalking poses in there, which is very fun. Um, so I think that alone even brings that to be a pretty good option. You could have some fun with making a pose where you don't have to worry about the rider, being seated for full tilt running. So that's kind of fun. Um, Unfortunately, in the product image, they slapped the 6-pack dude right in the front on the nice warg there.
Yeah,
But yeah, I think those are some fun options. It's nice that you can get them without riders too.
yeah. I think that flexibility is the key because riders themselves are very flexible, right? If you've got some legs, even if they're human legs, you can make a hobgoblin. You just have to decide you want to. And the other thing that we've seen a lot of that I've been really impressed by, and I think Jack did this himself with some of the wargs. I don't know which wargs, but when he was doing his hobgoblin army, he took hobgrots as they are, didn't have to bend their legs very much. They can sit on a mount pretty comfortably. And so he's got, incredibly cheap hobgot slitters, like 50 pence a model, um, just on the back of these cheap Lord of the Rings wargs, sitting comfortably and looking pretty natural, even without saddle, which I think is really cool. So recommend that you check out Jack's Hobgoblin blog if you are interested in this project as well. So let's move on from Wagistan. Let's go and look at a venerable old kit that's still out and still doing work, still doing business for GW decades on. And this is the Chaos Warhounds. Now, the Chaos Warhounds are not designed to be mounted. Um, they come, gosh, how many poses are there? I think there must be about five, maybe. Yeah, I think there's five poses repeated twice in a kit of 10. But that's quite nice. That has some good variety. You can work with that, especially for you know, a rare option, right? You're not going to be bringing big blocks of 20 of these guys or multiple regiments of them necessarily if you're building for the old world. Um, I like the Chaos Warhounds because they look chaosy. You know, they've got horns and mutations and big teeth, and they've got really gross looking faces, and mutations and pustules, and they can have snakes coming out of their heads and things like that. But the weakness with them is where you put your rider, because they're not designed for it. Some of the sculpts would be easier to position a rider than others, but in most cases, the rider has to go very far back, and you're going to have to trim something off. Maybe it's bone spurs sticking out of the warhound's spine, or maybe it's something to do with the mane, which needs to be trimmed in order to make your guy sit comfortably. But in either scenario, just be prepared. It's £20 for 10, right? That's a pretty good deal. What do you reckon, Joe?
It's a fair kit. I think there's plenty of different uh, versions of Chaos Dwarf armies. This might not suit the big hat vibe, but I could certainly see folks with more of the Helms variety army putting some hobgoblins on these pretty happily, and kind of leaning in to all the mutations and all that. There's certainly plenty of use for them. I don't know if it's what I'd pick necessarily, but it's a classic kit.
Is
I'd say probably can't really go wrong with it.
And let's plow on to another classic kit of 10, although it's been redesigned in living memory. And it is a lot more expensive at £35 for 10. The dire wolves from I'm not going to say it, I'm going to say it, Soul Blight Grave Lords, Vampire Counts. The dire wolves from the Vampire Counts are also a very long and storied wolf sculpt. Now, the thing is, they're dead. They're very ostentatiously dead. They've got exposed muscles, they've got exposed bones, they've got their skulls poking out. One of them has got a raven sitting on his back, eating him, slowly, but still, that would need to be removed. So you would definitely need to be going for an aesthetic, capital A, if you chose these guys. However, they do have really good backs for mounting minis on, like really good. Not as good as something that was designed for it, but given that they were not designed for it, you could fit Hobgrot on the back of these so comfortably. The only question is, why is it dead? But that's something that you can answer with your army lore if you so choose. Personally, I think with price being what it is and the fact that these guys have got bare skulls, they're not a choice that I would make, but they are something that you could choose. They're a useful kit that could do the job.
Yeah, I agree. We definitely have some dead dwarf collectors out there, so maybe there's room for some kind of detachment that makes some amount of sense. Not really sure, but I like the sculpts. It was definitely a remaster that was a bit needed. Yeah, I mean, there's kind of like I said earlier. There's a few. I don't mind the few unique poses in there as they're a bit more static, um, stalking poses. It's nice not having kind of the two classic poses that you see for four-legged mounts out there. But yeah, it's a decent kit, a little pricey, but certainly if you're going for some of those niche dead dwarfs or dwarf necromancer vibes, I could see it.
Sure. We're going to change tack completely now We're going to visit so many models that I never would have imagined before I started doing the research for this kit. I was aware of one of the kits on this list, but it always shocks me how many of these there are. We're now going to look at the Space Wolves range because there are some people in the grim darkness of the far future where there is only war who put on power armor in the morning and then go and feed their giant dog a steak, then get on the back of that giant dog in power armor and ride out to battle on a modern battlefield that has artillery and ranged weapons on it. Whatever you think of Space Wolves, and as a Thousand Suns fan of long renown, not much would be my answer. There are some really cool wolves in this kit, or sorry, in this range. You know, some cheap, some very expensive. Many of them, oh, excuse me, many of them extremely large. And that brings me to another point about conversions that you should consider doing. And that is not just proxying, but also more broadly, you've got some decisions to make about stuff like Black Orc Warbus on Wyvern. If you want to, you could put a Black Orc Warbus on Wyvern on the right sized base, but you could make it out of a monstrous cavalry sized wolf. And I'm going to try and indicate which is which when we go through this list. Why don't we start with one of the highest things that you get when you search for the word wolf, and that is the Wolfkin of Russ. Now, this is £85 for two giant fucking wolves, and you can see how big they are because those are Space Marines that they're eating, noble brothers of the Thousand Suns, no less. But they are companion models for the Leman Russ Primarch model, which is one of the worst ones. And so they come with scenic bases that they are built onto, which obviously is going to take some work from you as a modeler because you're going to have to deal with Forge World resin or not. And you're going to have to remove them from the Space Marines that they are in the middle of killing. However, if you do that successfully, what you get at the end of the rainbow is one of the biggest, best looking wolf miniatures that GW makes, in a monster size that you could use to make a really cool proxy for a wyvern, but also you could use it even, to be on a footprint the size of a chariot. Or simply you could put your hobgoblin Khan on it and just have a massive hero Khan. Obviously, your friend is going to need to, sorry, your opponent, I should say, um, is going to need to give their permission for the base size to probably be a bit off because you couldn't fit these on a conventional cavalry base. But they are big, dynamic poses with good backs for mounts. And from that perspective, I just kind of, even though they're uneconomical, right, £42 each, I kind of felt like I had to mention them because I think there is something really interesting there. Maybe someday I will attempt it myself.
Well, for starters, I'm just going to say I hate all of these out the gate, but I have to.
Yeah, they suck.
Yeah, terrible.
Um,
Space Wolves, no need for them. No need for them at all. No.
Conceptually,
That said, at least this first entry, I would probably take the Thousand Suns miniature off the base and convert it into a flying jetpack troop because that's what you do with scenic bases. Um,
he needs a jump packet to be winning.
yep, yeah, he needs to be winning. That's the only problem with this kit. But they look kind of like large bears, which you know they are ornate. Clearly 15 plus in for your younger modelers, unfortunately ruled out of contention here. But um, yeah, they're fine. That's Forge World for you.
They're big. They're big. You're obviously going to be getting them on the internet, aren't you? Let's face it. And from that perspective, like, just it's a concept. It's not something that you need for your army, and it's not going to be. Now let's talk about something that nobody needs. One of the dumbest miniatures to exist in all of Warhammer, the Cyberwolf, which is £14 for one model. Do not use the Cyberwolf. It is unacceptable. Chaos Dwarf technology is not fucking space 40k technology. You can't have a robot wolf with a mechanical leg. I will not allow it. A laser eye on a wolf. I know people love their pets, but the idea that this thing could survive on a battlefield, I mean, it looks like it already died, frankly, and has been necromancy back to life with a hydraulic leg. You can't use it. It's got a good back, and that's just about it. Other than that, it's got one contact point on the base, which makes it very frustrating to deal with. And also, more broadly, it just doesn't fit aesthetically. Don't use it. I ban it. I forbid it. You're not allowed.
Pass.
Um, you're going to pass even harder on the next one. This is the dumbest model. It's the dumbest model. The dumbest model. Logan Grimnar on Storm Rider, or as many people call it, Santa's sleigh. Um, what we're looking at here is two extraordinarily dynamically posed wolves sticking off the front of his base. Now, despite what you may think by looking at them, these are actually really easy to assemble on the sprue without the techno bits and to remove entirely from the kind of harness setup that Logan Grimnar and his stupid little hover chariot have got. Um, what you get if you do that is some very aggressive, medium-sized wolves. They're probably a bit big for a normal cavalry base, but they are good and useful, and you could mount someone on them if you want. But again, the aesthetic is going in a different direction than what we see with stuff like the Snarlfangs. And so, from that perspective, if you really liked one or other of them, you could. Kit is only £40. From that perspective, I don't think there's that much to worry about. But it is plastic, and the wolves can be assembled separately. So if you really like it, you really could go for it if you wanted to.
Woof.
Yeah. Um, Thunderwolf Cavalry. Now, I mock it because it's stupid. Um, the wolves, again, they're big, and in several cases, they have mild cybernetic augmentation. In case you didn't know, these are the wolves that are literally being ridden by Space Wolf Space Marines. So, from that perspective, they do have good backs for putting miniatures on. And the sprue is sold in such a way that the rider is completely separate and you can base the wolf and build the wolf yourself independently. However, there is too much cybernetic augmentation for me to be able to recommend this kit, right? Like, there's one that has an entire cybernetic leg, there's one with a cybernetic eye. None of those things are acceptable for me in a Chaos Dwarf context. And from that perspective, again, I've got to tell you, Thunderwolf Cavalry, it may look useful because it's built to play the role of cavalry physically, but I just don't recommend prioritizing it, especially given the cost.
Those look to be on regular, like round basis as well. Is that true?
Think those are quite big. I think they might be, if not 40s, then maybe 50 rounds.
Yeesh.
Um, but the Marines are junior Marines. And from that perspective, if you imagine one of them standing in the middle of it, you can see why I would estimate that
Hmm.
width, right?
Yep.
Um, I just, I just think on so many different levels, you don't need the hassle that comes with buying these. And you're not allowed robot arms anyway. So fuck off.
Yep. Fair.
And that brings us to the only kit that I genuinely recommend, but that I do strongly recommend out of uh, the whole Fenris thing, and that's the Fenrisian wolves. The Fenrisian wolves. It's 5 wolves. It's some wolves. It's a kit with wolves in it. They've got space to put a mount on. It's not perfect. Some of the poses are very dynamic. Um, but nevertheless, it is definitely one of the simpler options on this list. It's not particularly cheap at £25 for 5. Um, but I do think that if you like the look of them and you like the aesthetic, they are very aggressive looking, they're very angry. That's not something that you get with all the wolves. And crucially, they have really big heads. So I also think these would blend really well with the fell wargs. They're quite similar in sculpt, but ultimately you have to make a choice about whether you want to put a hobgoblin on the back of one of these things or not. Because if you really like the way they look and you want to do that, then you need to get on with it. But um, there's plenty of reasons to give the whole thing a swerve. What do you reckon, Jared?
No, this is obviously the Space Wolves, except it's just Wolves kit, no space, which is the best you can do here.
Yeah, yeah. You don't need those Space Marines, but they are sold physically separately, so I do recommend that. And then one last thing on this list is got one of the dumbest names in hip hop, um, Wolf Lord on Thunderwolf. Now, Wolf Lord on Thunderwolf is another monstrous cavalry-sized wolf, and from that perspective, again, it's hero only, but it is a fun dynamic pose, and it does have a good space for a mount. Sorry, to put a rider on. And from that perspective, again, if you're thinking still in terms of what do I have for a wyvern, how do I make sure that I have a big monster hero Khan, that wolf, you could do worse. You could do better, but you could do worse. The other problem with the kit is it's £30 for one miniature, and you get a useless Space Marine with stupid beard into the mix. So probably not. But if you really like the way that guy looks with all of his scars and everything, referring to the wolf, then I think it could be a positive thing.
Yeah. Worthless anecdote, but axes from Space Wolf ranges can be tailored into fun Chaos Dwarf conversions. Even, some have little skulls on them. Even sometimes they're wolf skulls, but like you can work with that. But if you cut off some of the cabling, especially in this case, like an ice axe, you could probably paint that up as a lava axe pretty convincingly.
Yeah, they're not known for modeling the ice into the act. Okay, so that's the Space Wolves done and dusted. We don't have to think about them again ever. That's just as well. Now let's look at third-party suppliers and exotic or strange mounts. Um, First up, I wanted to put classic fantasy from Wargames Atlantic. They're giant spiders. The giant spiders are designed to hybrid seamlessly with some rider legs that they issued in their goblin kit. But because the size of their goblins is very small, these giant spiders, if you tried to put one of the Battle of Skull Pass era Forest Goblin Spider Rider riders on top, you would need to drill some space for him because of the way that they've designed them. If you like spiders, these guys are a bit big to fit on cavalry bases, but they do actually look like real spiders, and that is important for some people. So you might want to choose them on that basis. But I recommend taking them as wolves anyway, just because the rules for Forest Goblin Spider Riders have never been particularly amazing. And from that perspective, like I do think this is a utility kit. It's War Games Atlantic, so it's hard plastic, but it's cheap. And in that way, I think it's uh, definitely worth considering if you want to do something more interesting than wolves.
Yeah, Wargames Atlantic has been doing a lot of good work with versatility kits from what I've seen. Don't own any myself, but when the Undead range they released recently, where you had good cross compatibility with chariots, with extra horses to cavalry, with mountable guys. It all seemed like they've been doing a good job with like making kits so you can kind of optimize and you'd have bits left over, but you can very much kind of swap between you want infantry, cavalry, even chariots, and that they've been doing some fun stuff. I'd definitely recommend checking them out.
Right. And I had to swerve my War Games Atlantic goblins because their proportions are wrong. I don't like the way they look. But I do know that you could choose that aesthetic for your hobgoblins, and I would respect it. Um, Speaking of kits that I didn't like, let's move on to talk about the Oathmark Goblin Wolf Riders. Um, Look, goblins have been riding wolves since Tolkien. That's not the point. Point is that what you have here is a box of 15 plastic mounts, and then a bunch of sprues of the kind of riders who bully them. And I think my issue with this is twofold. Number one, the riders are too slight, so they look like 25 millimeter sculpts. Um, they're just so weedy in hand and head, especially compared to like what the majority of your army will look like, which is GW standard sizing. However, let's say you buy the kit as I did, get rid of the riders and keep the wolves. There is still a big issue with this kit, and that is that they have one of their seams is right down the middle of the forehead. The foreheads, as you can see, are extremely flat, and as a result, there's a big gap. There's a big gap that needs to be filled by putty running directly through the middle of the head of every one of these goblin mounts. However, you do get a really good number of them in hard plastic for relatively cheap. So I think it's worth considering that box, even if you have reasons to doubt it.
They are pretty chunky. I'll say that. The wolves.
Yeah, although because of the modest nature of the riders, the way in which the riders are quite small proportion, the backs of those wolves are quite slender, and so they're not
Mm.
amazing for putting like 90s metal riders on, for instance, which is annoying because it's exactly what I tried to do. But you know, you can't win them all. Okay, on with the show. Let's look at two Mantic models. Right. Now, look, I know that Mantic has a bit of a reputation. We're going to do an episode of this show looking at what's good in the Mantic range, hopefully changing people's minds. I cannot say in good conscience that the Goblin Fleabag Riders are particularly high quality models. And I say that as someone who owns one regiment of ranged and one regiment of hand weapon. And the thing is, they clearly wanted to make Wolf Riders. They decided to make all of the mounts have this comically enormous head that then has this giant gaping mouth in it. That, you know, the law says it must be fed at all times, right? But in practice, what it's resulted in is a particular sculpt that, even though there are 5 or 10 different variations on what the actual flea bag looks like, um, they do all end up looking the same because they've got their giant mouths open. And it's a question of how good the person showing you the model is at painting teeth, which they're usually not that good at. If someone came to me and said, I want to do Mantic, I want to do my Wolf Riders with the Mantic, what I would say is don't use the Goblin regiments. They are old. Use something like the Ratkin Hack Paws. And these are just a repeat of the old sculpt that we were just talking about for the goblins, but with a much more realistic snarling face. Um, that, you know, obviously they're being ridden by Skaven, which is a bit of a non sequitur, but you can really easily convert Skaven like that into hobgoblins by cutting off their tail and just not thinking about it too hard. So from that perspective, if you were going to go to Mantic, if you did want to save money, then my recommendation would be to go with these Skaven Ratkin Hack Paws, and then make the decision later as to what you want to permit in terms of Mantic aesthetics across the rest of your collection.
Yeah, I think those Skaven mounted Skaven are a much better play than the other version. They even, if you did do the head swap, they even have the kind of the weapons that look more like you'd see an orc weapon with riveted on extra spikes. I think it totally works.
Yeah, Mantic's aesthetics are confusing at times, but ultimately tremendously, you know, positive thing when they get it right. And I think with those Ratkin hack, I think they got it right. I hope that they will go back and correct what they did with the goblins. But you know, I think they're a business and they have to make money. So from that perspective, I don't think that's their top priority. All right, let's plunge forward into the weird, monstrous mounts. And these are mounts that you could theoretically fit on cavalry bases, might be more interesting taken as fan rules for something else, whether that's an allied orc and goblin contingent with boar boys in it, or whether you want to play Warhammer Armies Project hobgoblin cards and you want to play monstrous cavalry. There's usually a monstrous cavalry option. The first thing I'm going to recommend for that is Warlord Games Samurai Riding Kumino Lion Dogs. Now, one of the reasons I like this so much goes all the way back to the start of the Hobgoblin range. The Hobgoblins had, as part of their range, in the very earliest days of the 80s, a Temple Dog Rider as a piece of cavalry. And this is ornate, kind of statuary lion dogs, or temple dogs as they're often called, ridden by samurai. Now, the samurai have normal human warlord proportions, which is not heroic scale at all, especially on the hand and the weapon. But I think you can navigate that because you can just do a nice simple head swap. And before you know it, you've got some slightly scrawny looking hobgoblins riding around on some extremely ferocious looking mounts. And I think in the long run, that averages out quite well, because what you have is a unique statement piece. And the way that Warlord built this kit, it's five separate sculptures, right? These are not the same shape as each other. They don't have the issues that the Fell Wards have. They really are, looking very distinct and separate. So that's the Lion Dogs.
Yeah, I like those. Straight out of nowhere. Classic. Yeah, I mean, I think this remind me of when we talked on the podcast with Toronto. Seems like it would be a fun fit in Ninth Age too for any of those players. But yeah, certainly Army's Project Hobgoblins. That's a great candidate.
Yeah, I just like the fact that they're in dynamic and separate poses, without looking particularly stupid or only having one leg contacting the ground. Um, but equally, you've got to be comfortable with the aesthetic of slightly scrawny riders, or you've got to get busy doing arm swaps, which may still not look good. And on that subject, we're going to move on to a model which is actually now discontinued, although it's still available for sale in a number of different places. And that is something from Privateer Press's Hordes range, or defunct Hordes range, because Hordes no longer exist, called the Praetorian Ferox, which is a cavalry unit for a faction called the Scorn. They're small saber-toothed tigers ridden by spearmen wearing ornate, kind of Eastern-styled armor. With some surgery, you could turn these guys into monstrous cavalry to support your hobgoblins, or you could just not do any of that. The only question really is whether you can find a set of Criterion Ferox, whether you like the look of saber-toothed tigers. And once you've made those decisions, I do think these fit on a regular cavalry base, but it might be a bit of a squeeze. Um, you might just be better off thinking about how you could use these models in a different context, or using different models. But I think they fit into that same monstrous cavalry category that we were just talking about with the previous entry. And from that perspective, I feel like you can have a lot of fun with them.
Yeah, makes you wonder. I feel like there's another use for these, but I'm not coming up with it right now. I like to look at them in general. I'm not a huge Privateer Press knower, but yeah, they almost have a Blood Knight look, but that probably just the Scorn paint scheme, to be honest. So you could certainly find some use for them.
Yeah, it's a pretty relentless paint scheme, I won't lie. The other place I guess one could see them is Ogre Kingdoms, but they're not really big enough. So
Mm-hmm,
from that
mm-hmm.
perspective, I just like them for elite hobgoblins, or something to go in a Carnate army. Um, Again, I think they could be made to rank up if you forced it, but you might have to think ahead about positioning on the actual base. All right, and then one last one, just because Linus suggested it. How's it going, man? And that is, in fact, he's done it. It's a Star Wars Legion dewback with a stormtrooper on the back. Now, look, it's a giant lizard with no wings. It would make a perfectly reasonable version of a Wyvern if you wanted to do Black Orc War Boss on Wyvern. However, A, it doesn't have any wings, which means, it is not filling the fundamental role of telling your player what the Wyvern-based character can do. But B, it comes modeled with Stormtrooper legs integral to the monster itself. Um, Listen, you're a talented sculptor, whoever you are listening, but you should not be bothering to resculpt an entire person's legs. Okay, unless someone is paying you very, very well for it. So from that perspective, yeah, the Star Wars Legion dewback rider, I mean, it's theoretically an option. I've seen it be done, and I can understand the role that it might play, but I can't recommend it personally. I think it's too expensive. You only get one in a box for $30 US. And I also think that at the end of that rainbow is nothing really of value because you can cover those bases elsewhere, and it's far, far too large to be used as anything other than a monster. So from that perspective, it's not personally for me.
Yeah, I'd say of these last few, I'd certainly pick up the lion dogs if only for the meme, but yeah, definitely prefer those over the other sculpts.
Well, that has been my whistle stop tour, fellas. I think there are way more options than anyone needs. So many different subcategories of WAG alone. But then at the same time, in the long run, whatever you choose to do with this unit of light cavalry, it's very likely that you will have a moment in time where your army only has one unit of hobgoblin riders in it, and you decide actually that's not acceptable, and you decide to collect them on purpose. But you know, as with all of the things on this list, it is about personal taste. So do take some time to dive into the pictures and just think really carefully before you capitulate and just buy the Snarfangs because they'll get it done. Just be thinking about whether you want to do something a little bit more interesting and creative. And if so, I recommend that you buy some Fell Wargs.
Yeah, I think worth noting if you do find yourself with wolves and no riders that you can find, Lost Kingdom's range, in my opinion, the riders are the best part of the Mongabo's range. We've seen people put them on other mounts as you'd have likely some problems with scaling. You usually need to scale Lost Kingdom down a little bit, although with the old world that might be a moot point. Um, but to moot on that a little further, we've seen people throw them on like EMNG's files, but you could certainly see them scaling down to some of the things we've talked about today, and that would get you around some of the issues with scaling down the riders, but needing to scale down the wolves by an increased amount, as would probably be happening in order to get Lost Kingdom to rank up well. So might be able to avoid some of that if you just went for the Mongabo riders into some of these other kits and scaled them appropriately. But you have to be willing to do some scale printing experimentation if you're going to go some route like that.
A dangerous game, as veterans of the 3D printing troubleshooting channel will attest.
Certainly risky if you're going the Etsy route, since you can't really do that on the fly.
Mm, true, true. Maybe there's no perfect solution. That's a shame. I always thought with 3D printers, you press a button and a magic toy comes out.
Yeah, I hear they
Right.
just make toy.
Well, good old People's Republic of China. They really do. Okay. With those covered, that's it for my mount recommendations. If you have more, then please do add them into the comments of the thread on the discourse for Bits and Chits. But in the long run, I think the most important thing to do is decide whether you're going to be someone who slavishly follows the rule book, in which case you need something that fits on a skinny base, or whether you're going to challenge the conventions of modern society by having a much more bodacious base. And that's hard to predict, but in the long run, we'll have to just find out. All right, that was everything from us. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode, and we'll catch you again in the next one.